So I want you to pay close attention to these sequences to see if you could catch just how Michael Chandler was able to create these openings.
Chandler didn't appear to land.
Yes, and right now you are taking kicks.
Chandler didn't.
I actually didn't see what was going on until I studied Justin Gaethje's habits, and I realized what was actually happening, and it's pretty fascinating. Now, there were a lot of interesting interactions going on that allowed this to happen. In fact, there were a lot of technical details going on in general in this fight that looked like pure chaos on its surface, but the technical details underneath are worth exploring. And if you stick around, I'm going to reveal the technical side of how the madness happened the way it did, and it may actually change the way you view this fight. This is what happens when you take one of the most feared and violent fighters in the division and you put him up against a vicious tank with the urgency to prove his worth. An outrageously savage fight broke out.
Didn't appear to land.
He did. Goodness, he heard.
If you're familiar with Justin Gaethje by now, you'd know that every time he steps into the cage, he always wins a fight bonus for spectacular performances. And for good reason. He's incredibly violent, yet he still manages to unleash chaos in a technical manner. Then you have Iron Michael Chandler, a fighter cut from the same cloth of toughness. He popped up onto the scene after terrorizing his opponents in Bellator, and now the UFC is his new battleground. When these two fighters threw down, bodies dropped left and right, with Justin Gaethje coming out as the ultimate winner. But the story of this fight reveals something interesting about the fighters who left it all in the cage. We got a better sense of Chandler's habits, and it told us important things about where he stood amongst the elite. Likewise, Gaethje's performance highlighted an important part of his journey as a fighter and his growth since his inception into the UFC. To get a better understanding of the story of this fight, we'll be taking a look at the strategies that took place, the tactics used, and the habits shown by both the fighters. The story will become clear after I share what I discovered, and if you're interested in how their technical abilities line up, the signature moves, stay tuned because I think this video is going to be perfect for you. Chandler made it very clear that coming into this fight, he wanted it to be a war, and that's exactly what he got. Right out of the gate, Chandler came pressuring forward, and for the most part of the fight, he kept that same strategy. Early on, it was pretty easy to notice that Chandler had a speed advantage. He was always explosive, and he had the ability to step in and probe it with that jab or coming off a jab cross. Even Chandler admittedly mentions that his approach is pretty basic, and honestly you see that in how he attacks. You don't see a lot of variety in his rhythm or striking dynamics, but he's capable of finding shots through reliable basics. However, you're going to see later on in this breakdown that this is going to be a downfall. During the earlier rounds, Chandler was able to use his stepping jab on multiple occasions to open up offensive entries. He was even able to stun Gaethje with his basic jab cross combo. In the earlier parts of the match, Chandler's speed made it really difficult for Gaethje to establish his counters. This is why you'd see him typically miss his signature counter, parrying a shot and then throwing a counter punch. Chandler just could step in very quickly to poke that jab, and he's very quick to evade when Gaethje tried to counter. Slowly but surely as the fight progressed, Gaethje started to find his rhythm, and when that finally happened, things really started to go downhill for Chandler, and there were multiple reasons for this. Before we move forward in understanding how this fight played out, there's something important to consider about Justin Gaethje. I covered this in depth in my breakdown of Justin Gaethje vs. Tony Ferguson, but I'll highlight my point in this video as well. Justin Gaethje has come a long way since his inception into the UFC. I talked about his progress and how he's changed from his wall and brawl style to the kind of Justin that you see today, where he's become a fighter less willing to take a shot in order to deal one back. He's also a smart fighter, not willing to let his pride overcome the smarter options to fight more effectively. Justin has grown wiser in his decision making, and he doesn't really fall back to old habits so easily if the opponent tries to appeal to his violent senses. Even though Chandler made it a point to show that he would not take the first step back to prove who had more bravado. Justin wasn't going to fall for this game, and he's evolved beyond a point where he isn't easily going to revert back to a style that make him take so much damage. With how he used to fight, he even admits that he only had a few fights left before calling it quits. But after his work with Trevor Whitman, a lot of that has changed. Gaethje hasn't abandoned his inner impulses to go to war, but he has learned to unleash it more on his own terms. This is why you see him more willing to take a step back if needed, or to move away from damage rather than tanking it. Instead of taking shots all the time on his guard like he used to, you see him switch it up a little bit more by using counters that involve evading damage completely and then delivering punishment. I feel compelled to tell this part of the story because looking at how he's changed allows us to see why he fights the way he does today. If we were to look back on how he used to fight back in the day, one of his go-to counters was to absorb the shot on his guard, then he would throw his power shot slipping off his center line to lob the opponent's heads off. Fast forward to today, he still occasionally uses the guard, but he's a lot more willing to avoid damage with something like a parry to deliver a punishing blow right afterwards. To Chandler's credit, he had some success landing his shots, but I didn't see a lot of consistent strategies that he could rely on throughout the entire fight. But there is one strategy he could at least find some consistency with throughout the fight. He would often use his jab in order to get Gaethje into guarding up so that he could rain body shots. This can prove to be effective since Gaethje is using a lot more weaving and slipping movements, so attacking the body is a good way to make sure that he still scores since the body is still open to be hit during these kind of movements. It appears that Trevor Wittman really favors weaving and head movement styles because you can see a lot of these habits more frequently in his fighters like Kamaru Usman. For what I can see, both Colby and Chandler did notice this and tried to exploit it a few times. When it came to exploiting these kind of movements, for Chandler, he would also attempt to throw uppercuts when reading that Gaethje would slip over or weave, but he just couldn't quite find the right kind of tactics in order to exploit Gaethje's habits. One way he did try exploiting Gaethje's habit of slipping or weaving was to dip low to bait him into going for the uppercut to catch him on the way. But Justin did have some good replies to this by countering these sequences when Chandler tried to dip the feint in order to draw his reactions. Like he would throw his lead hook counter as Chandler tried uppercutting. Then the most effective counter probably had to be when Gaethje would actually time a simultaneous uppercut as Chandler tried to dip low in order to feint. Chandler's body shots did work well against Gaethje, and it seemed to be the only strategy that he could be consistent with throughout all the rounds. However, you do have to keep in mind that Chandler had to use his jab as a means to enable his body shots in the first place, but Justin had several good answers to his jab. For example, you'd see how he would slip and then throw his lead hook counters to punish the jab. Or you'd see him slip and then throw devastating uppercuts when he was able to recognize that Chandler had a habit of dipping his head low to throw his jab. There was even one point where Gaethje was able to bait Chandler out with his jab in order to get Chandler to habitually dip low, and then he was able to punish him with the uppercut. And then you have his signature counter where he'll pull the head back slightly and then parry the shot in order to throw his power shot counter, just like how he was able to devastate Tony Ferguson pressing forward with the same counter. This counter is very similar to how Conor McGregor counterpunched Nate Diaz's jab. He would pull back and parry at the same time. Now the parry does protect you from the jab, but it also helps clear the hand to allow the path to the head, and then the pull kind of acts as a secondary defense in case the parry fails. Just a technical tip, a reason why you'd want some kind of head movement with your parry is that sometimes the opponent can bait you into parry and then expose your opening, so you want a secondary defense just in case. And here you see Joanna parry, but she doesn't use much head movement and exposes that opening for a hook. I sampled so many instances of this counter and came across at least 15 instances of this actually attempted. From what I observed, about 70% of the time this was landing and the remaining 30% of the time that was missing. A lot of this was due to the fact that Gaethje was missing in the earlier rounds, where it was hard for him to get his timing down. It's pretty hard to attribute why Gaethje landed this so many times. It could be a combination of many factors. I think it could be Gaethje getting better with his timing as the rounds went on, or it could be Chandler fading with his speed as another factor, because his speed and reaction time did seem to decline as the punishment went on through the rounds. As usual, Gaethje is known for his leg kicking game, and he slammed a whole bunch of them on Chandler, so the accumulation of those kicks may have hindered his ability to explode with movement. This might have paid off in the long run since it probably allowed him to connect his timing a lot better for an opponent with battered legs. The way Gaethje times his leg kicks is pretty good because he tends to time the leg kicks when the opponents aren't able to block them. You generally want to lift the leg or turn the leg out to block the kick, but if you time the kick in moments where they're not likely to block the kick, for example when they advance forward, they can't easily block during those transitions. So if you time it right, just like Gaethje was able to do, he was able to kick Chandler as he stepped forward. I want to move back to Gaethje's parry and counter sequences. This parry and counter was used pretty consistently throughout the fight, and to my surprise, because Chandler didn't seem to read this counter, or he did recognize it, but he didn't seem to have an effective way to actually reliably answer it. It's a little bit concerning because it might show the extent of Chandler's ability to bait and punish. The theme that was taking place here was that Chandler was mainly the aggressor, and Gaethje was the one who was counter-punching for the most part. For Chandler, in order for him to get the upper hand, his role would have been to play well by baiting the counter punch or baiting out whatever counter habits that were going on and then exploiting them. For Gaethje's habit of parrying specifically, there's a lot of options of finding ways around the parry. Ideally, you would want to draw the parry out and exploit the openings that they leave. For example, with Max Holloway, one way he exploited Volkanovski's parry was to fake a cross to get Volkanovski into parrying and then firing a head kick when he found his opening. Likewise with Kelvin Gastelum, he habitually likes to slip and parry in order to come back with his lead hook counter, just like he was doing a lot against Adesanya. But with Robert Whittaker, he would bait out the parry of his jab cross and then punish the head kick when he found his opening to the parry. Or how about Thug Rose faking a straight punch to draw a parry and then coming around with a gazelle hook once her opening was present. I didn't see too many options that were working for Chandler to handle Gaethje's parry. However, there was one really unique interaction that I just have to share with you all because it's surprisingly effective. You see, Chandler was throwing his lead hook and slamming that cross like what I showed you in the beginning of this video. He managed to land this often throughout this fight and he even stunned Gaethje with this. But if you look very closely, you're going to see that Chandler is actually looking to hook with a hand trap to Gaethje's arm. So you might be asking yourself, why exactly is this effective? But most importantly, how did it actually create an opening? This is the cool part about what I discovered. By first understanding Gaethje's habits, things become a little bit clearer. If you pay attention to Gaethje's signature counter where he tries to parry the jab, then fires his power shot counter, notice that as he throws his parry, his lead hand drops and he actually leaves the opening. You have to consider that Chandler was landing a lot of stiff jabs, and then he would eventually switch it up by throwing that lead hook hand trap instead. Gaethje got used to the jab coming, so he was attempting to parry a jab instead of a hook, so this is where things kind of went wrong. The issue is that he can't exactly parry the hook because it's way too far out of his parry zone, so what this actually does is that it creates an opening down Gaethje's center line as he tried to parry. And since Chandler is using his hands to trap with his hooking arm, he completely shuts off Gaethje's ability to throw with that power hand in order to counter. So when Chandler stepped in to throw his hook hand trap, this accomplished two very important things. It created an opening for Gaethje's center line as he tried to parry a hook that he couldn't really parry in the first place, and it also prevented Gaethje from using that rear hand to counter back. I thought this was such a brilliant interaction, but Chandler found only a small handful of success with this unfortunately. I was only able to observe exactly 2 instances of this landing clean where he would draw out the parry, create that opening, and then shut down Gaethje's power arm in order to land his own counter shot to stun Gaethje. These interactions took place during the earlier rounds, and from what I was able to study, Gaethje seemed to be a little bit more cautious in the later rounds about letting Chandler set this up again. For instance, instead of parrying the lead arm, he would actually parry the rear arm so that when Chandler tried to throw his power shot again, Gaethje actually had the ability to block with his lead arm free. When it comes to Chandler's fight, he had the tools to bait out Justin's reactions. His jabs was the catalyst to the majority of Justin's reactions, but he didn't have many effective tools to actually answer those reactions. It also didn't help that Chandler doesn't really utilize body or head kicks in his game because this would have opened up more ways to answer Gaethje's habits. By Gaethje having several different ways to answer Chandler's jab, Gaethje effectively stifled one of the main ways that he had to attack him. Gaethje seemed to have very good answers for many of Chandler's attempts to attack, and we saw this in how he was able to punish Chandler, for example when he was trying to dip low to bait Gaethje. And then we also saw different examples of how Gaethje was able to punish the multiple jabs that he attempted. This is why towards the end of the round he actually started to see a lot of inactivity. Chandler wanted to attack badly, but one of the issues is that most of his efforts were met with very brutal responses, so it made it very hard. Even though Gaethje was capable of punishing Chandler's jab, Chandler was surprisingly tough and refused to back down the entire time. Chandler had such a hard time figuring out Gaethje, and it might highlight some limitations of his striking skills against the top of the division at this moment in time. To be honest, Chandler still makes a lot of fundamental flaws in his striking, and it's a little bit concerning feature about him because this is quite literally the reason why he lost the title fight against Charles Oliveira, for making very rudimentary mistakes such as exiting without a defensive option in place. Like here, when he tries to go on the attack, he comes back up his center line without any kind of protection in place. You have so many options to exit defensively. You could choose to weave or roll out after your attack, or you can even choose to wall up after your attack. But having nothing in place is probably the last thing that you want to do at the top of the division. Everyone at the top is high level. Everyone's technique and execution is fine-tuned. In principle, you always want to make sure that your technique is on point, because if you ever find yourself in a situation where you and the opponent do the same technique at the same time, the one with better form will have the edge. The issue is that Chandler's basic mistake is what is getting him punished. In the fight with Gaethje, he was coming in regularly with the jab without guard in place at all. This is pretty dangerous because it puts you at risk of eating a hook to the face if the opponent times a hook as you come in with their jab, like Gaethje was able to do on multiple occasions. It's very typical to see fighters drop their hands during a jab, but this tends to be okay because one of the main reasons why fighters can get away with this is because they actually master entries in a variety of rhythms that makes it hard for the opponent to actually predict they're coming in. This is why it's hard down. Unfortunately, Chandler got punished a lot easily off of his jab attempts due to not masking his rhythms when he came in with his jabs. Based on what you can observe, Justin's main signature counters are built off being mindful to taking damage. As a result, you typically see this slip and rip style counterpunching where he'd move his head to evade damage, then throw counters. All of this is far from how he used to fight. Justin Gaethje has become more mindful about taking damage, so it's really interesting to see how he fights, because he used to be the type of fighter who would always press forward to bring the devastation while never taking a step back. However, he's somehow become a fighter who has no problem letting the opponents come to him. Make no mistake though, he hasn't let down the amount of violence that he unleashes. The story of this fight was centered around Justin Gaethje's ability to progressively find his counters and to exploit Michael Chandler's openings, many of which were present due to his fundamental mistakes, like his habit of coming in with no guard and eating Gaethje's counters along the process. But Chandler did show some moments of fascinating strikes as well, when we watch him create openings with his power shot to make it through. And in the end, Gaethje was more consistent overall in his efforts as he found answers for Chandler's approaches. Despite how incredibly durable Chandler was, Chandler just could not quite solve Gaethje's puzzle. With what he has shown so far, he has the power, he has the heart and durability, but when the opponent is capable of weathering that storm to impose their strengths, we're getting to see him push to the limit, and it makes you wonder, where does Chandler stand in the division? Can he hang with the upper echelon of the elite? Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed my analysis. It was a lot of hard work, but I hope I earned your sub today. There's a lot of tactics I covered from Justin Gaethje that I really get to talk about, and it's from a style that I covered long ago, from when he used to fight a little bit differently. But I think there's a lot of interesting things to learn from that style, so if you're interested, you can always check out the article I wrote about Justin Gaethje's fighting style before he entered the UFC. There's a lot you might be able to pick up. Also, there's a lot of details about his style and how he's changed a lot throughout the years. You can also check out my breakdown of Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje on my channel. You can unsub at any time. Newsletter subs currently have access to the content that I will be describing below in the description and the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter subscription for updates on content. I like to send important content updates out, and sometimes once in a while I like to send out exclusive content to my newsletter subs, so if you don't want to miss out, I would consider subscribing.